Imagine you are 10 years old, and your father takes you through a door in the backyard. Not a shed, not a cellar for canning jars, something else entirely. You go down a short set of concrete steps, and the air changes immediately. It is cooler down there, heavier somehow. There is a smell you cannot quite name, part damp earth, part fresh paint, part something metallic. There is a cot along one wall, some shelves stacked with canned goods, a hand-crank radio, a few jugs of water, and a small calendar someone has pinned to the wall. A flashlight hangs from a hook near the door. Everything is organized. Everything is waiting. Your father tells you this is where the family would come if something happened. You are not entirely sure what something means, but you understand, the way children understand things they are not supposed to fully understand, that this place was built out of fear. That place was the backyard fallout shelter, and for a brief but very specific period in American life, it was one of the most talked about and quietly constructed features of the ordinary suburban home. Today, almost none of them remain in use. Most have been filled in with dirt, turned into storage space, or simply sealed off and never mentioned again. What happened to them is really a story about a particular kind of American anxiety, and about what happens when the thing people feared never quite arrives the way they imagined it would. But to understand why they disappeared, you first have to understand what they were, and what it felt like to live in a country where building one seemed like a completely reasonable thing to do on a Saturday afternoon. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had moved out of the newspapers and into the neighborhood. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. Both nations were developing hydrogen bombs that made the weapons dropped on Japan look almost small by comparison. Civil defense had become a national project. The federal government was actively encouraging ordinary American families to take personal responsibility for their own survival. Films were made, pamphlets were sent home through schools and post offices. The message, delivered in the calmest possible tone, was this: nuclear war may come, and you should be prepared for it at home. The fallout shelter was the physical answer to that message. Unlike the bomb shelters of World War II, which were mostly public spaces built to protect people from conventional explosives, the fallout shelter was a private structure, built specifically to protect a family from radioactive fallout in the days following a nuclear explosion. The idea was straightforward. If a family could stay underground, shielded by concrete and packed earth, for roughly 2 weeks after a blast, the most dangerous levels of radiation would fall enough for them to emerge and survive. Plans were widely published and freely available. The Office of Civil Defense distributed detailed guides showing exactly how a family could dig and build a shelter in their own backyard. There were different designs for different budgets. Some were little more than a reinforced trench with timber overhead and a foot of soil on top. Others were fully poured concrete structures with ventilation systems, radiation meters, and enough supplies to last a family of 4 for 14 days. Hardware stores began stocking shelter supplies. A small but real industry of shelter builders appeared in cities across the country, offering to handle the whole project for families who wanted something more substantial than they could manage themselves. By the early 1960s, estimates suggested that several 100,000 American homes had some version of a shelter on the property. Inside, the shelters were a kind of compressed portrait of home life. Families stocked them with the things they could not imagine surviving without. Canned food, of course, but also specific brands the children liked. A deck of cards, a Bible, aspirin. Some families packed a change of clothing for each person. Some kept copies of important documents sealed in a waterproof case. Others left small toys for the younger children. There was something deeply human about the way people furnished these spaces.
Even while preparing for the worst, they reached for the familiar. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the moment when all of that preparation felt most immediately real. For 13 days, as the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union played out through diplomatic channels that most Americans could barely follow, families across the country looked at their shelters and thought seriously about using them. Hardware stores reported a surge in the sale of canned goods and water containers. Some families actually moved blankets and supplies down into their shelters during that period, not because they were certain something would happen, but because that level of uncertainty demanded some kind of action. And then the crisis ended. The missiles were removed, the radio returned to music and baseball. The shelters stayed in the backyard, stocked and waiting, as autumn turned to winter and winter turned to spring. What began to change after that was gradual and harder to name. The immediate fear of the missile crisis faded. Arms limitation talks began. The nature of the nuclear threat started to shift in public understanding. Scientists and doctors began speaking more openly about what a large-scale nuclear exchange would actually mean, and the picture they described was one that 2 weeks in a backyard shelter could meaningfully address. Reports and books published through the 1960s suggested that in the event of a full nuclear war, survival itself might be the lesser mercy. The shelter, which had felt like a practical response to a manageable threat, began to feel inadequate in a way that was hard to argue with. There was also the quiet exhaustion of sustained fear. A country cannot maintain emergency-level anxiety indefinitely. By the mid-1960s, the cultural energy around civil defense had visibly softened. The government, which had once enthusiastically promoted shelter construction, began redirecting its messaging. The focus shifted towards larger community shelters and eventually towards the idea of evacuation rather than sheltering in place. The private backyard shelter, which had always been a middle-class suburban phenomenon to begin with, gradually stopped being discussed as a serious priority. The shelters did not disappear overnight. They sat in backyards through the late 1960s and into the 70s, slowly losing their original purpose. Some families converted them into storage space. Others used them as a cool spot to keep wine or extra canned goods in a more ordinary sense. Children who had once been told to take them seriously now used them as clubhouses or hideouts. Some were simply locked and forgotten, their supplies going stale, their radiation meters gathering dust on a shelf. When families moved or homes changed hands, many had no idea what the structure in the backyard even was. Many were filled in during renovations, others collapsed over time, the wooden frames rotting beneath the soil. A few survived long enough to become curiosities, discovered by grandchildren who had never heard of civil defense, who climbed down into them not out of fear, but out of pure fascination with a world that seemed impossibly distant from their own. What is lost now is not just the shelter itself, but the particular texture of everyday life it represented. There was a period in this country when a father could spend a weekend building something in the backyard, something designed to save his family's lives, and that was considered a normal and responsible thing to do. When a mother could pack canned soup and crackers into a concrete room and feel she was doing exactly what a good mother should do. When a child could go to school in the morning and practice duck and cover drills before lunch without the adults around them appearing to think anything unusual was happening at all. That was not a simple or comfortable time, but it was a real one, lived by real people who were doing the best they could in a world that suddenly became very difficult to feel safe in. The backyard shelter was their answer to that feeling. It was built out of love as much as fear, by ordinary people who wanted to believe that something they could build with their own hands might be enough to hold the darkness back a little longer. If you remember one of these shelters, from your own yard or a neighbor's, or if someone in your family once talked about building one, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Those small memories are exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to preserve. If this kind of storytelling is something you appreciate, please consider subscribing. There is a great deal more of this quiet history left to uncover, and we are glad you are here for it.